Thank you, and good evening, everybody. In accordance with the requirements of the open meeting law, please be advised that this meeting is being recorded and broadcast over the Lunenburg Public Access Channel. Is there any public comment from the board? Please.
Okay, my first is just wanted to say if we could please add just a reminder, the ADA transitions topic to future agenda, so we can talk about, maybe moving things like Selectmen's meetings to a more accessible meeting location. And then in regards to our executive session later on, I just wanted to reiterate what I said last week, which I would prefer if we would consider doing that in open meeting, because it is our choice. In regards to the Harvey Lane property, which is the path, I hiked it today, and in about 10 minutes you get from Gilchrist to the Lane property right at the site of the Peter Charpentier Memorial Bridge. It's a great port of entry for the town. Perhaps we could be using it even more, and so I want to be really careful with that topic.
Any public comment from the public? Please. Could I ask you to go to the podium, please, Ken?
Ken Chenis, 715 Page Street. I just wanted to address two things with the board, if possible. My first is a concern with the what's being called the land swap over on Gilchrist Street. The concern is that we currently own a strip of land that goes from Gilchrist Street all the way to the Lane property, which is passable, and the town can do what they want with that land because we own that land. There's discussion, I guess that's going to be in closed session, about swapping that in exchange for an easement into this same piece of property that would allow us access to a trail that would be then on conservation reserve property, but we would have restricted access to it, as would be declared by whatever the terms of the easement were. I'm very concerned about us swapping our right to pass to our property in exchange for an easement, which puts the rights in a legal situation. No matter how good the legal terms are established for the easement, it can inhibit our future use. And in the same neighborhood, we made this exact same mistake several years ago, and we lost access to a piece of our land because the terms of the easement prevented us from being able to use it for what we had intended. The trouble with easements is once they're established, you have no rights to go back and reestablish them or renegotiate them. The land remains in the ownership of who owns the land, and you are just granted whatever rights the easement gives you. So if for some unforeseen future use, you want to change the terms, you have no right to do that. So we are really giving up our owned right to access that land. And I think that's a really not a wise decision for the town to enter into. I understand there's some swapping of land that's adjacent to the river, and I don't think that the preservation of land around the river exceeds the value of our ability to access the Lane property. It's a great public access today, and we could certainly expand its use, and it would be ours to do with whatever we need to. So if we have to widen that up to the width of the property so that we could get a truck in there for fill to fix an erosion problem, we would be able to do that. If we just had an easement, we may not have the right to do that. So we should be very careful about that. The second thing that I did want to mention is on the same topic. I don't understand why it's in a closed session and why we're not having a public hearing about it, because I would think that the townspeople would want to talk about it. I only found out about it because I happen to be a member of the planning board and I saw the proposed A&R, and that's how I got exposed to this coming out, which was public, so I'm not revealing anything that was secret or anything. But I just, when I saw that, I was really surprised that we were even talking about doing it. And then, of course, I found this topic on on one of the Facebook pages that was discussing this, and everybody was discussing it as if it was a land swap and we were getting an ownership strip out to this property. And that's not the case based upon everything that I've been able to uncover. We're exchanging ownership for easement, and I think that's a really bad idea. And I don't understand why the town's not being allowed to discuss this and why it's in a closed session. That's it, thank you.
Any other public comment? Okay. Our first appointment is a town manager appointment for Police Lieutenant Thomas Gamble. I guess I should call the chief forward, please.
Good evening. On 17 July 2018, the town manager appointed Tom Gamble to the rank of acting lieutenant. The appointment was ratified by the Board of Selectmen that night. The appointment resulted from the departure of Mike Luth, who was a lieutenant at the time, who took a job as a chief of police over in Groton, as you recall. The purpose for the acting appointment was to have an opportunity to post the position for 30 calendar days for submission of letters of interest. The notice was posted on the Union Bulletin Board on July 22nd, 2018, and emailed to the full-time officers to satisfy Article 30 of the Local 353 CBA. I received one letter of interest, and that was from Acting Lieutenant Tom Gamble. As promotions are an exclusive managerial prerogative, those rights retained by reserved exclusively to the town and the chief of police. Tom's been a law enforcement officer for 27 years, although I had previously stated 28, that was an error. As stated at the July 17th Selectmen's Meeting, Tom attended Curry College where he earned a Bachelor's of Arts degree in Criminal Justice Administration. He began his career in law enforcement with the Honolulu Police Department, then moving closer to home, taking a position with the Pepperell Police Department, and then later hired by the Lunenburg Police Department, where he served for 18 years, 16 of which he's been a sergeant. During the last several years, Tom's been assigned as a day shift supervisor, where he was required to take on numerous administrative duties. Tom's work during that period on days has been invaluable. He was a senior sergeant with more time and grade than any other officer. Tom's recent transition to lieutenant has been seamless, and without a doubt, I think he's the right choice for the position, and with that, I respectfully request that his appointment be made permanent.
Thank you.
I would make a motion that we ratify the town manager's appointment of Police Lieutenant Thomas Gamble, effective August 9th.
Second.
I think we want to make it effective this evening. There was a revised letter in there. In your package.
Okay, so we want it tonight? Oh, sorry, effective August 14th.
I'd amend my second.
Any further discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Congratulations, Lieutenant Gamble.
Very much.
Thank you. We have some other appointments. Election officers, Deputy Warden Michael Gale, clerks Kathleen Pliska and Darlene Steele, inspectors Ellen Aubuchon and Ellen Gale, and deputy inspectors Ernest Aubuchon and Ann Shattuck.
This is an annual appointment?
Yes, it's through the 6/30/19.
So moved?
Second.
Any discussion? All those in favor? Aye.
Aye.
And then we have a resignation in your package from the election officer warden, which I will read. Board of Selectmen, after much personal deliberation, I have decided to resign the appointed position of election warden. The resignation will take effect immediately. I have served the town of Lunenburg and have been involved in all aspects of the election process for federal, state, and town elections for 54 years. It is time to pass the baton along. Sincerely, Janice P. Carrier.
We'll make a motion, we accept the resignation with regret for Janice Carrier effective August 8th.
Second.
Any discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
And we do have a letter in here thanking Jan for her service. And I understand that we've notified both parties.
I don't know that.
Yeah, that's what I was told today. Okay. Do we want to get the current business out of the way before we do our workshop? Why don't we do,
Sure.
we don't have any minutes. Are there any warrants?
Yes. It's a state primary warrant.
Okay, there's a state primary warrant for the election, the primary elections. It requires several signatures.
And a reminder to everyone that the primary is Tuesday, September 4th.
And a accounts payable warrant in the amount of $425,633.96. Are any action items? All right. So then, the remainder of our open meeting is the earth removal bylaw review workshop, and I think we've invited the planning board to join us. I don't believe they have a quorum, but they're welcome. The members that are here are certainly welcome to join us at the table. And I believe Anna Bernie is going to lead us, and the
Yes.
town council is going to be part of that discussion.
Looking for you. I have extra copies of what I gave you last time.
Ken, do you want to join us?
If you don't join us, you may be put in charge of a committee.
You could be the secretary.
Want that?
Okay, so we've talked a little bit over the years about earth removal and how it's been the selectmen's bailiwick since it was put into place, and how up until recently it's just kind of been a matter of course that they're renewed and reviewed, and I think at one point we maxed out at about 12 or 13 permits in town, and that was spread amongst, I think, 4 operations. And in last year, in the last renewal cycle of 2017, there was probably a more in-depth review of the permits as they existed than had been done, probably in the previous decade or so. I can't speak too much further back than that. And it was identified that at least 2 of the permits should just be closed because they weren't active and they weren't meeting the thresholds that were required. Excuse me. And there were 2 other operations that were holding permits that they wished to retain. One had 2 permits, the other I think had 11 over at Keating. And the 2 permits that Powell had were fairly low volume. One was on a site that was essentially closed, and they committed to putting together a closure plan, which they submitted to you and the board accepted at the last meeting. And then there's another one that's still pretty low volume. And then there's a large operation that does a fair amount of earth removal and processing, and just a large mixture of things. So what the board sort of said is they'd like to sort of get a handle on the bylaw itself and maybe look at transferring use or the implementation of that bylaw to the planning board, who deals with plans, conditions, approvals, that kind of solid engineering work on a more regular basis, and probably is more familiar with reviewing some of those plans, and it fits in with some of the things that they do, especially where some of the exemptions that would fall into the bylaw, they're permitting those uses anyway, and so it allows a little bit more of cooperation between what they're doing and the earth removal bylaw. So I looked over the existing bylaw, and unfortunately it took me a little while longer than I wanted, but yesterday you should have gotten, or tonight in your drive, there should be a really, what I'll call rough draft of a proposed new bylaw. You'll notice it's very minimally redlined, because the only red lines I really put in was what section was being replaced by the section in the bylaw, because I changed almost all of the text. And what I did retain was fairly small, and I think it just was easier to start new with what's on this proposal than it was to try and craft through what we have. All of the elements of the previous bylaw are here. I'm a little annoying about how I order things, so it was bothersome to me to go through it and have severability stuck in the middle of it, and the purpose and then the enforcement and applicability. So I tried to make it a little more logical in the way that it flows through, and in doing it, a lot of what I heard at the last meeting and over the last year about earth removal is, well, what's the impact on the neighbors? What's the reality of the operation? How do we close it? What's the closure plan look like? Are there standards? So I took a two-tiered approach, as I kind of like to do. The bylaw lays out the purpose, definitions, what we're trying to accomplish, why we're trying to accomplish, the legal requirements, and then a set of regulations that operates as the implementation document. And that gets more into the specifics and what's required as far as filings, what some of the performance measures might be to qualify, the detailed performance measures to meet the more omnibus performance measures in the bylaw. And that allows, and whether this stays with the selectmen or goes to the planning board, I would recommend an approach similar to this. The regulations allow you to be a little more nimble and change things if you find they're not working, without the need to go to town meeting and argue over every size of plan or number of plans, because that's really operating and how you're doing things, and the bylaw is really governing what you're trying to accomplish. The other thing that we've talked about a lot is earth fill. And right now you can bring as much fill as you want into Lunenburg and kind of dump it wherever you want. I don't think we have a huge problem with that, but there's nothing to say that tomorrow that couldn't change. So there's an earth fill section in here as well that talks about filling beyond a certain point, outside of certain exemptions, and gets into some of the specifics of how much earth is coming in, how where is it coming from, has it been tested, or what the contents of it are. So that would hopefully address some of those issues. I spoke with counsel very briefly today about this, and he said, is this my speak now or forever hold your peace? And it's not. This is like, oh, we're going to talk about this. We should have something to start talking about. So nothing in here am I like, oh, you have to keep that. It's, let's start with this, and if it gets chopped apart and stuff gets added, stuff gets taken out, that's great. It's just it's a place to sort of start the conversation. We talked about it very briefly last night at the planning board, and what I told them is I would expect this would be something we would see at annual town meeting if the board is looking to make that amendment, and give some time to really think about it and chew on it and dial it into where they want. And the other thing, which I know is always a big concern, especially at town meeting and for some of the folks in the audience, is what happens to existing permits. And there's a section in the bylaw that talks to existing permits, and it would allow them to continue for the life of the existing permit as it was issued, And in this case, this went to annual town meeting. I would expect the selectmen would be issuing one more set of earth removal permits in 2019. And then in 2020, at the expiration of that permit, the folks who are still holding an earth removal permit would be required to meet the standards of this bylaw. And what I'm proposing is a tenfold increase in the threshold. 10 cubic yards is one dump truck, and that's a really low bar for what would qualify as earth removal in a lot of cases. I'm proposing 1,000 cubic yards. Again, that's, let's talk about this. It's a target. I'm also proposing 3-year permits with 2-year extensions as opposed to a 1-year permit. These operations may be nimble in as much as they can change what they're removing and selling and creating to meet the market demand, but it's not very often that you're going to have an earth removal operation, at least on the scale that we have them, that's like, okay, well, in 1 year, we're going to be done with what we're doing. The building inspector and myself went out to have a tour of the facility down at Keating's, and they were talking, they have 50 to 100 years worth of potential removal in some of their parcels. So this isn't an operation that's happening in a quick sequence. And if we think about it, they've been here for 60, 80 years. So this is a huge operation that has a huge life. They own an immense amount of land, and this starts moving them and the town into a direction where we're all kind of on the same page. And I think this might mirror a lot of what was talked about at the last meeting with some of the geological surveys, the what's out there, how much do you plan to remove, what might it look like. There's requirements for test pits on areas that would be cleared, or that would be the basis of the removal. So what I tried to do is kind of incorporate a lot of the stuff that we've been talking about in a sort of conceptual scale into something that we can start to look at and pull apart. And I was asked at the last meeting sort of unsuspectingly, does the plan that was submitted for closure by Powell meet the standards? And I think it does, and the more I've thought about it, the more I think really what the closure plan is, excuse me, a response to how much earth you're going to remove. Where are you going to stop? What's the final grade of stopping? And are you going to vegetate it? What are you going to vegetate it with? And if you're not going to vegetate it, what's going to be the material or the use? And in a lot of instances, the closure plan is going to be, we're going to get to this and we're going to put grass down. Because you can't look too far into the future in some of these things and know what that property may be worth, what the economy may look like, what the town zoning may look like, and what a final use may be. But it's also something that, as time moves on, you can start to amend that closure plan as you renew. So that's sort of what I attempted to do with these bylaws. And I think the last thing that really was discussed was what's the impact on adjoining neighbors from this type of operation. Currently, I think it's fairly minimal in the areas that we have them because the parcels are so large, and the areas where removal is happening are either adjacent to other removal operations or are far enough away from the edges of the parcel that the neighbors, they may hear a machine now and again. They may hear I don't know if they blast over at any of these operations, but they may hear the pop from a blast if that's something that happens. But I don't envision that it's appreciably more disturbing than the train going by at 10 o'clock at night, which I hear at my house, which is probably 3 or 4 miles as the crow flies from the train tracks. And these operations are happening during the day for the most part, when the majority of people are either up and functioning or not at home because they're at work. So what I looked at was putting some hours of operation requirements in, 7 to 5, which I, again, flexible, but I don't think that's outside of the realm of when the majority of these operations are happening anyway.
Who handles the permits in those towns and communities? I mean, is there a norm?
It's Massachusetts, there's really not a norm for anything. I think that it's not uncommon for the planning board to handle it, it's not uncommon for the selectmen to handle it. I think it really is based on the community, how they want to do it. Most of the communities that I've worked with, it's been the planning board, but I do know that there's a vast number of communities where the selectmen handle it. So it wouldn't be odd for it to be in either realm. And to be frank, I think if you went to the planning board and said, I know we talked about you guys taking it, we don't want to give it up, I don't know that you're going to get a huge fight from them about it. But I don't want to speak for the two that are here.
So I appreciate the work that you've done on this, and I like the concept of a bylaw and the regulations, because the bylaw then becomes the Constitution, and the regulation get to be the day-to-day implementation. And I support it moving to the planning board with the concept of land use. I look at this as a land use discussion that I see the planning board with its other permit granting authorization be most appropriate to do that. Also with your position and you personally, the reality will fall to you anyways. I did, as you've known, as I've mentioned before, the town of Uxbridge has had issues with what they call the fill, where there were large parcels that used to be gravel removal, and soil was coming in from other parts around the state, and the question became the quality or the poor quality of the soil that was actually in there and how that was going to affect people's water, wells, other things like that. Their bylaw, I like how your bylaw does removal and infill. It makes sense. It's a little bit more coherent. They have two separate bylaws, and their bylaw requires a soil management plan, whereas I think your regulations are a little bit, the person has to give you a statement where the land came from and certify other things like that. I think there needs to be a little bit more, and theirs goes over 100,000 cubic feet of fill, so it's a very large thing. So I don't want to create more issues, but the reality is that, especially as you get to the urban areas, there will be contaminated soil that may not meet the standard of having to be put into a special landfill, but we don't want that soil coming into Lunenburg without us knowing about it and having the proper safeguards. So I just ask you to look at the Uxbridge one for either in the regulations or the bylaws. I tend to prefer some of the language in the bylaws, because then it's requirement for the planning board to implement.
And I did get your email about the Uxbridge bylaw, and I did see the soil management plan, so I guess what I would probably propose is like a two-tiered approach. You'd have to make the statement for everything under that, and then when you get to this massive operation, I think that makes sense. I didn't really go back and fiddle around with this after that, but I do take your point, and I think that that's something that we could probably throw in the threshold as, everything over 1,000 cubic yards of fill or 18 inches of rise requires earth fill permit. If you exceed whatever the threshold would be, you'll also require a soil management plan, and then detail what the soil management plan would look like in the regs.
The other thing, if people have been reading the Worcester Telegram regarding Uxbridge, the issue has been that it's not clear whether all the loads of soil were properly tested. And the reality is there's a standard by which you test a certain amount of soil, and that covers a certain amount of loads. So I think the other opportunity with this is that the reality is, with the Keating property being the largest open earth removal permit, eventually they're going to get down so far and use all their land, and it's going to need to be filled in, and that becomes new economic development opportunities for us. That may be 20, 30 years down the road, but this is the time to make sure we're doing things correctly.
Just a clarification question on timing. You said 19, and I'm trying to figure if that's calendar 19 or fiscal 19.
Calendar 19.
So we're currently coming up on a renewal at the end of this.
Yeah,
current
you're
month.
in that renewal process. So
Right.
if we were to bring this to annual town meeting, and it soars through, as things always do at town meeting, and it goes off to the AG, she has 90 days to review and return her review of it, or her office's review of it. And then we have to post for 90 days, and then the bylaw takes effect. So even if magically on the 11th day, the town clerk is able to send that whole packet to the AG, and they're within their, let's say they're fast, and they get it back to us in 45 days. That's the middle of the summer, and then you hit a 90-day posting, you're into October, November, and you've already passed your threshold for the renewal requirements under the current bylaw, which we would still have to operate under before the general bylaw goes into place, unless something's changed. Because like zoning, we could say, oh, well, it goes back to the first advertisement, and you do this at risk with the potential that something changes, but it doesn't work that way with general. So I guess in theory, you could give them like a 3 or 6 month permit, but I think in good faith, you would go through your permitting process and give them the standard permit, and then that would give them the ability to have reviewed these since they've come up in April for posting, and have a chance to look at them and really get like 18 months of reviewing it and looking at it, and be able to bring themselves to a point where they can come back and file for their renewal and be in compliance.
In addition, once the bylaw is approved and posted, then you have to do your process to adopt the regulations.
Correct.
So that's another 30 days.
Yeah.
Or
And I mean, those could be ready to go once the bylaw becomes active, especially if we're talking now about doing it and we have an idea of what we want. It would really only be 14 days if you got really, up in it.
So your first 3-year application under the new, assuming everything was approved, you're under the new bylaw and regulations would be when?
2020.
January of 2020.
January.
Or,
You could move it earlier, but the
Well, it would-
permits expire in December, or when do the
permits expire in August.
That's what I was
yeah.
trying to figure out.
August.
So it would be August of 2020.
I mean, we could make the bylaw so that it's a January to December bylaw. I don't know that it would appreciably matter one way or the other. I guess it's up to us how we...
Well, you never know when somebody's going to apply for a permit. It may be a
Yes,
year
I
from
mean-
when they apply, so.
We're not beating earth removal permits away currently. It's not like something that we see a lot of, so you're right, anybody could walk through the door, but it's not an easy game to get into, I guess.
I mean, the more recent, current, new gravel removal bylaw was the subdivision off of Elmwood Road.
My understanding was they didn't get a permit.
Well, that was part of the question, is that because it was part of the subdivision rules and regs, it was exempt. One of the things that came up at that point, and I'll channel Paula Bertram, was whether there should be a requirement for a certain amount of removal, even if it's in conjunction with a subdivision, whether it should trigger.
So I went the opposite direction. I continued subdivision exemption because there's a bond in place already.
Which includes the removal and
Correct.
restoration.
So
of
if
that
someone's preparing a site, I excluded building permits and septic systems, because those are things that people do all the time. And, someone who goes and gets a septic system and finds out, wow, I need to dig a giant hole that's, 1,200 cubic yards. It's almost unfair to make them come and do an earth removal permit, because they're not removing earth as a business or as a way to make income. They're doing it because they have to have a place where their effluent can go.
I think they're, sorry.
I guess my example was that could have been an earth removal
Sure.
without a subdivision.
Yes, yes,
So
but that-
there may be property around town that may still.
There's, I can name.
Yes, so I want to talk about what Bob talked about, is a loophole where we have Keatings and Powell's as, they'll always be the obvious ones coming in, because that's what they're doing for work. But then the loophole is somebody who's preparing a site or doing some sort of development project, and they're doing high-end earth removal situations. And I was, I guess, victim of one today. 496 Mass Ave is doing earth removal. And it's, I guess, some sort of development site, and there was really horrific erosion from it today, to the scale I've never seen before. And so that project falls exactly into this gray area. I think that Bob is talking about, it came up last night at the planning board meeting, that if everything's going smoothly, sure, it might be one person's septic tank, or it might be one developer's little cut into the forest. Or it could be what happened today, massive erosion across Mass Ave, and it all ended up and dumped into the wetlands, and it was quite a sight. So I think there is this gray area here that if we have these areas that are being worked on and it's not clear how long that removal will go on for, or exactly what the operation is, that we want to make sure that gray can't happen.
Is that the water department building?
It's the land.
Well, it's not the building yet, that's right, no building yet.
Those should have erosion and sedimentation controls, so that's a failure of their site management. And that's something we'll look into. In general, when someone approves a site plan, special permit, subdivision, there's an erosion and sedimentation control plan in that would, in theory, avoid that sort of issue. There should be hay bales, there should be silt fencing, there should be a large riprap, a construction entrance to scrub the tires and stem that flow of mud. If that's not happening, it's something that we need to address through an enforcement angle.
And also, it's been an earth removal site from, as far as I could see, all summer, and I'm not sure if they have a permit.
They do, well, they don't have an earth removal permit, they have a site plan approval. And if I'm not mistaken, the current bylaw exempts that.
So I think that one of the things is that we need to make sure that however it's managed, that when we address this proposed bylaw change, that we address how those other issues are addressed, whether it's in another board or whatever, you know, and whether we should be having the exemptions here if the removal is higher. And I understand you talk about having a bond there, but in here you've talked about a possible bond for
Correct.
new projects as well.
Maybe we want to have exemption limits.
Time, capacity.
Yeah.
Quantity.
And I know, and town council, you can probably refresh me on the case, but I think it was in Hull, there was a case where an individual had wanted to build a tree farm and he spent about 10 years removing the earth to prepare the site for the tree farm. And the courts found that was earth removal, but I think there was a case either before or after where a shorter period of time wasn't subject to earth removal based on the fact that it was site preparation. And I may be mixing the facts up, but that's my recollection. I've dealt with this in another realm.
No, you're generally correct. I mean, there are an inordinate number of cases that exist that address earth removal in the courts, and they really all circulate around this issue of the tail wagging the dog. You know, when is it that it's an earth removal operation with an ancillary benefit upon completion of a subdivision or some other form of development? And when is it a subdivision or some other form of development that is simply excavating earth to prepare the site? And that's a challenge in crafting a bylaw, but communities have gotten more careful in recent years, and certainly that can be achieved. You can structure it in such a way that you eliminate those loopholes.
Right.
Now, I know that you refer in your proposed language referring to the wetlands bylaw, and I appreciate that. When you do that, that's probably going to cover 90% of Lunenburg, as we're discovering where all the wetlands are.
Sure.
Because one of the things that you've got in other parts of the country, and it's not going to happen here, but people taking down mountains for the minerals underneath. The reality becomes that might happen in some places where it's a rural area. And I'm not saying that that shouldn't happen if it's going to turn into a place that's going to be usable, other things like that. I think of Route 70 in Lancaster near Kimball's. There was a large removal of earth along there to the point where they lowered the ground 3 to 4 feet right next to the road. So it's trying to manage it, not prevent it. Some places it should be prevented.
So what's our expectation? Is this workshop to work any level of detail on either the regulation or the bylaw? Or to get acceptance to go forward?
I walked in expecting you guys to get out a red pen and start, crossing words out, and I know, 24 hours is not nearly enough time to read through something like this and digest it. And, this is something that the selectmen currently have industry over and have expressed some reservations about the way it's currently done, what's currently in the bylaw. So I guess to me this is the beginning of a conversation that probably lasts over several months, that terminates with or culminates with a bylaw proposal for town meeting. And whether that bylaw is something that the selectmen continue to retain control over, or it's something that moves to the planning board, I don't really have a dog in that fight. I mean, I think I'll probably be more involved in the planning board side of it, but I don't see us crafting a bylaw and me kind of going, see you guys, have fun with earth removal. However it lands, it needs to be done in some way. So my expectation is a conversation starts, I get an idea of whether I'm moving down the right path, or if I just, whiffed and we're all wondering why I'm sitting here talking about this and I need to go back and start over.
And go ahead.
I don't think you whiffed. I think this is a really great starting point, and I also agree with what Bob said earlier. I think it belongs with the planning board, being a land use item. If even selectmen did handle it, I'm sure you would be here presenting it to us or walking us through them anyways. But I think the planning board is better built to handle these types of applications.
I expected to come tonight not to redline, but to talk about the major issues, similar about what's an exemption, the 1,000 cubic foot limit before it starts, whether that's realistic or not. And I don't have an opinion. I would look to find out what other communities have. The whole concept of the infill, what should be there, what regulations on that. But that's why I see it as a land use, because it really is not my expertise. I have opinions, but it's not my expertise of what gravel removal and infill should do. I think we've been lucky to have had responsible people. There have been other people in the past, there have been enforcement actions on that I remember one meeting, watching it on TV, and one person said, well, the contractor taking it out gave me permission, and within 15 minutes that contractor showed up because he was watching on TV and said, I did not give that person permission to do what they did. So the reality is it's an active thing, and I think that since the planning board and the building and the land use all get involved in lots of land use enforcement actions, I think that's where it makes more sense.
And I think the 1,000 cubic yards is reasonable, and that's why I put it in there. That's a lot of earth, and that's the point where you start to say, okay, this is a big operation, and a lot of earth. I've seen 500 in several communities. I know Westminster has, I think, 2,000. I think what I think is 10 is just, that's a little tight. I would say we want to be up between 500 and 2,000. I kind of split the difference and went with 1,000, which is on the smaller side. But again, that I think it's better to look at those things than not. And again, I would look for a temperature on 3-year initial permits and 2-year extensions.
I think that makes sense because it's a business decision. You're going to put in a lot of money to start the process, and 3 years is a decent amount of time, and that I personally think that's good.
I agree.
I guess, I think there's a role as a steward of the town's property, if you will, the property in the town, not the town-owned property, that the selectmen play and that the planning board plays, and I guess to a lesser extent, conservation and stormwater and anybody else that plays in that arena. And I think that what we've already established is it probably makes sense to work a plan to move the actual administration of an in-place bylaw or rules and regs to a land use type organization. I think the question becomes, who makes the decisions as those are written, and what's the timeline to do that? And that's what I see as kind of our workshop effort, whether it's tonight or some other milestone along the way. It's, 500, 1,000, 3 years, 5 years, those kind of decisions. Is that best made here? Is it best made, ultimately it's approved by town meeting, but
Sure.
But who drafts what we believe is a good regulation and a good bylaw and therefore good regulations?
And I guess, we have some of the planning board and most of the selectmen here, and I haven't heard much from the planning board, but I think I got an indication in general that, they would accept doing this, and I haven't really gotten a sense of where they fall in what's in here, but if they're going to be the ones who implement it, I guess my thought would be they would sort of drill down into what's in here and come back and talk to you about it, because this board has been doing this for half a century, and there's at least some institutional knowledge about what the issues have been, what the desires are, and where we might be able to trim something, add something, how it's all going to function. And I would, I guess, see another workshop like this kind of coming together where you've maybe had a little bit more than 24 hours to look at what the proposal is and say, this looks great, or well, let's talk about this, and have a more animated discussion from both sides of the table on what the proposal is, why it is, and what the select board thinks of that.
And I would add the Conservation Commission,
Sure.
stormwater, is for the direct use per people as well.
And I think it's very telling when we work on this that we always have Adam here, or last week we had the building commissioner, and kind of like, help us out. We did actually ask you, or somebody asked what we should do. And so I think that's where the gray area and the loopholes always going to fall into something that is the planning board's jurisdiction. So if it's this idea of Butterfly Lane or what's going on with the 496 Mass Ave, that we'll never be able to really follow through with that, where if it's with the planning, no matter where the earth removal's happening, it's all in the same space.
I like to call that one throat to choke.
You're welcome.
And, I think the last thing, and I think town council will be able to answer this better than me, was there was some question about property owner versus permit applicant, and I guess an analogy would be in the planning board, if somebody rents a building, they become the applicant for, say, a special permit to do a use there in front of the zoning board, or they're leasing land and they want to build a building, and they come to the planning board and they're the applicant for site plan approval, and it's issued to them with the property owner's permission. So the property owner is signing that this individual or corporation or conglomerate or whatever has authority to represent the rights of this property in this process. So personally, I guess professionally, I think that the person performing the action is the one who should be permitted, because if something goes wrong, they're the person you're going to go to and say, you did this wrong. If it's a family trust or some sort of venture capital group off in Texas, and you're trying to produce enforcement action against them you're going to be chasing your tail, as opposed to going down to the site and finding the person who's actually operating there and saying, hey, you did this wrong, now we're going to enforce the conditions of the approval.
The only thing I would say, though, is that if the permit holder is not the owner and they skip town, you want to be able to go against the owner to restore the property. So I think I would welcome additional input on that part.
And in this case,
the sewer commission has had that issue with a tenant having a grease trap, not being maintained, not paying fees, and is the property owner responsible for that when the person moves out? So and I think they came down with, they're now giving notice to both parties and making sure that it's being taken care of. So I just want to make sure that we're going to have the remedy, and so the part of the questions, if you require a bond, who's going to require the bond to be paid by whom, and who do you enforce it against? I don't have an answer what we should be doing, but I think that's a topic that needs to be addressed.
Adam, was there anything that did come up? I think we covered it in a very general term. Was there any specific input you would have for us, Adam Costa?
Just generally with respect to the bylaw. So, as Adam had said earlier in his presentation, I called him earlier today to discuss it very generally in a bit of a panic and said, I got this 24 hours ago. Is this my only bite at the apple? And he said, no, you've got time. This is an initial draft, and we'll work through it. But I did give it a review. I think the mechanics of it are great. I think that the concept of a bylaw paired with regulations that contain some of the more substantive standards that contain and relate to the procedural components of making an application, what the plans must show, how many copies, those sorts of things. I think it always makes good sense to include those in regulations because of the ease of modifying or amending them in the future. So I appreciate that, the organizational structure of the bylaw and the regulations. In terms of the bylaw itself, I also think that Adam did a bang-up job. I think it's a great first draft. I've got some minor comments on it, some of which I think are in keeping with the things that I've already heard you say tonight. I've got some comments on the exemptions and how those exemptions are structured, and the ability that butters or the town would have to require a permit, even where an exemption is met. I want to be sure that there's an objective and not a subjective standard, that this bylaw isn't applied or can't be applied in an arbitrary or capricious manner that would open it up to challenge. So I've got some concerns there. I think we can work through that language. I'm also particularly mindful of what Bob had said relative to the importation of fill, and I understand that that may not be an issue today in Lunenburg, but it could be an issue in the future. My firm has been directly involved. We were hired a number of months ago in Uxbridge as special counsel in litigation against the entity that has been involved in all of the, I guess I'll call it wrongdoing, or alleged wrongdoing in Uxbridge. And so I'm familiar with the issue that exists there. I'm obviously familiar with their bylaws. And I think that we can work provisions into this, not necessarily having to adopt a separate bylaw, but working them into the earth removal draft that Adam has already circulated to address the issue of importation, and to what extent that's permitted, to what degree testing is required, other oversight, and subjected to a permitting process much the same as the earth removal. So I think that's also something that we can talk through.
Thank you. I also noticed some folks that were here last week with real live earth removal permit issues, et cetera. We're not having a hearing or anything, but then we're early in this process. But any of you guys want to say anything to us? Please.
Kevin Young with PJ Keating. First of all, appreciate the opportunity for the workshop and the effort the board is putting forward here. Simple, when it becomes appropriate, we'd love to see a draft when that's public and available for us. If you would appreciate any of our comments, we've been through this before in multiple communities. There might be some areas we can provide some useful perspective. Appreciate several of the comments. You know, in regards to earth removal operations being nimble, you know, So there's gravel operations, there's quarries like we run in the town of Lunenburg, and that is a 50-plus year investment in property and equipment, and that's a long-term process. So, and a lot of money invested for a long-term investment. So consider that in the application. Also, differentiating between sand and gravel and quarrying can become important. We've seen that come up in other communities because they are very different applications in how you apply them. Again, as it becomes appropriate, we'd love to see a draft and assist you where possible. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else?
And I just want to say that I think PJ Keatings has been a partner on this. Over the years, there was less than direct review by the board. I think that they have been responsive to questions. They certainly have been supportive of many fundraising efforts in the town. Not that they get to pay that to help things later, but I appreciate their offer to do the communication with our drafting process.
And I believe Powell's been a very good citizen as well.
You're right. Yep, not meaning to leave them off. Yep.
Right. Do you think you have what you need to take us to our next step?
Yes.
Anybody else have anything to?
How, if we are to formally give it away, when do we do that, or how do we decide it?
It happens through the bylaw.
Okay, so the bylaw
as part of everybody agreeing that the bylaw, because the bylaw actually names the permit granting authority, and right now it says planning board, so once town meeting adopts it and it becomes legal through that process, then you guys kind of get to do this.
But we very much want to be part of that process along the way. Great.
I just had one question, Mr. Chairman. Town council's opinion on the property owner versus the permit holder.
Sure. So I'm aware of the issues that the sewer commission has had in that respect that Bob referenced as well. So my answer when I get that question typically is, well, what does the bylaw say? And so I think that we need to be careful in how we craft this to achieve the objective that we want to achieve. If that objective is to, in most instances, have an application made by the true applicant, the individual or the entity that will be performing the excavation or the importation of fill, then I think we need to say so. I think if the intention is that the permit will run with that operator and not run with the land, I think we need to say so. To some extent, we've got to be careful because we can't dictate exactly who makes an application. We can say that we want the applicant to be prepared to submit information or documentation to establish that it's going to perform the operation in a particular way, but the property owner can come forward, and if the property owner is prepared with the assistance of someone else or not to present that information and gets the permit, and then hires a third party to operate, unless the permit conditions specifically say that's prohibited, that would be permitted. So it's a combination of what does the permit say, but also I think that we can, where we're getting into the ground floor here with adopting an entirely new bylaw, we can craft the bylaw to specify what the objective is and to state that there's a real need through the submittal requirements and through the explicit statement as to who the applicant is. There's a real need for the permitting authority, whether it's the selectmen or the planning board, to understand who's going to be operating the facility, who's going to be operating pursuant to the permit, even if it's not the landowner, and even if the landowner's authorization or sign-off is required, the applicant ought to be appearing before you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, gentlemen.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay. You'll note on our agenda that we are now listing our 3 goals as old business, and they'll be there as a standing agenda item that we can discuss, add to, or report against at any time. All right. Our upcoming meeting schedule, we will meet once again in August on the 21st, and then we have 3 meetings in September. Have we identified the workshop in September yet, or are we still working on it?
No, it's usually the second meeting.
Right.
of the month.
Okay, so we'll continue to work on the workshop component in September. Before I accept the motion to enter executive session, is there any public comment from the public?
Hi, good evening. Todd Dwyer, Vice Chairman of the Conservation Commission. I'm here with 2 other commission members, Bob Pease and Ken Jones. We'd like to address before you go into executive session, talk about the land conveyance at the Gilchrist Street. We prepared a letter. I have copies for each of you.
Can I clarify if you're here as the Conservation Commission or as a private citizen?
I'm here as, well, both. I'm a member of the Conservation Commission, but we don't have a quorum, so as a private citizen.
If you're, okay, because if you're presenting as the Conservation Commission, you would need an agenda item.
We're not.
Okay.
So with that, Bob's gonna...
You go first with the letter. I got it in my hand.
All right. I don't know that I have to read the letter into the record. You have it before you. Generally, what you'll see is the letter outlines the support that the Conservation Commission provided to the selectmen, our support for conveyance of the land. So there were a number of, go ahead.
I was going to ask Town Council to weigh in on where we are here in this public comment from the Conservation Commission.
Weigh in what respect?
If this is a public comment from a citizen?
So I think we're in the public comment session of the meeting.
That is correct.
Certainly, a citizen can make a public comment, a member of a public body can make a public comment. Generally, it's in the chair's discretion as to the extent of that public comment, and there's nothing that would prohibit a public official, a member of a board or a commission to participate in the public comment session. You know, how extensive that discussion becomes is generally a matter for the chair, and I always recommend that there be certain limitations placed on it so it's not rising to the level of a full agenda item on the selectmen's agenda if it's not already there.
And I think generally, public comment and board comment has been just that, and that we don't discuss the comments, they're comments. And that if there's an agenda item, then we talk in the agenda item topic, but otherwise it's comment and we don't respond. Generally, we could publicly comment in response, but we can't start discussing it if it's not an agenda item.
So we're a little crippled here.
No, that's the public comment process, is that it's public comment.
Go ahead, please.
All right. Very good. So the property at 171 Gilchrist, Conservation Commission in their letter states that they've looked at this property and they do a few things that I think is valuable for everyone to understand. One, when they look at the conveyance, you know, what can happen to the land? It can be developed as is, whether it's there's this conveyance goes forth or not. Based on my understanding, based on the current zoning laws, you know, up to 5 new homes could be developed there. 2, one or several new property owners could own the current trail and access to the lane property, which is the lane property, for those who don't know, is a Conservation Commission controlled property that is owned by the town of Lunenburg. that provides recreation to town members. So without this conveyance, the access to the Lane property could be in jeopardy. So the town does own a 20-foot strip of land adjacent to this property, but there's currently no trail access to the Lane property on this strip of land. And if we were to develop it, we'd have to impact existing wetlands, which I think is not a good idea. Also, other things to think about. This land could be utilized for other activities such as logging, agriculture, which would allow it to be cleared. So the 7 acres and Mulpus Brook, which abut this property or are on this property, would be vulnerable to all that new development. So those are the items that they looked at. Bob, are you ready to go? So Bob's going to go through some other things regarding the 171 Gilchrist.
There's just a small difference between this.
I'm highly uncomfortable that this is not a typical public comment and we don't have an agenda item to be participating in this. And I'm just saying I'm uncomfortable as a selectman with this topic.
Thank you.
I'm a member of the Conservation Commission and the Lunenburg Open Space Committee. I function as the Lunenburg Conservation Commission's trail steward for the Lane property and for the large town forest, and I'm presently working with the Massachusetts Regional Planning Agency to develop trail maps for all of Lunenburg conservation lands. The trail map that you see up there is a result of that work with the Massachusetts Regional Planning Agency. The part we're talking about is right over here. We presently have access over here from Holman Road. There's a trail out here that goes out to Gilchrist, and there's no direct access over here presently, and that's what I'm going to talk about right now. Next slide. So this is the same map, only this has property lines on it. And then next slide. And so this map taken shows, this is the town strip right here. This is the town strip. This is the large property. This is the small property. And you can see we've got a trail. The trail that goes across the back here. Eddie Sozik has allowed us to continue to use this trail, you know, even though, you know, to access, and so it's used by the people in the neighborhood to access the Lane property in the large town forest. Next slide. This is from Mass GIS, and it shows that there's a wetlands across the back of this property. And right over here, the wetlands turns into a stream. And where the stream crosses the trail, it's flat and it's rocky, right there. And where the 20-foot strip crosses the wetlands, right there it's about 20, 40, 50 feet wide, the wetlands, and it's a swamp. The next slide. So this is where the existing dirt road or trail across the back crosses the stream, and you can see it's rocky, you know, and it's a dirt road, and it can support vehicles. Next slide. This is where the 20-foot strip crosses this wetlands. There's a swamp there. It's about 40, 50 feet wide. Right now it's about a foot and a half deep, foot deep. And on the opposite side, now I'm looking at it here from the south side, towards the north. The opposite side there, the bank isn't firm, you know, the ground is all mushy. Next slide. Nearby, there's a causeway, not on town land, okay, which is rocks topped with gravel that was put there by the farmer many years ago. So if you can easily go down the 20-foot strip and reach the Lane property through there, but you have to cross this causeway, which is not on the town strip, and if we don't make this trade, we won't have access to this town. We won't have access to this causeway. Final slide. And so this is just another shot of that same area right within the 20-foot strip. And so I'm speaking as a citizen, not as a member of the Conservation Commission. I'm speaking as a citizen. To me, you have a choice. You know, you can have 5 lots, a 20-foot strip with no trail on it that crosses a swamp and wet ground, no ownership of mulpus, no protection from logging and agriculture. Or you can have 7 house lots, use an existing dirt road trail that crosses the stream over rocky ground, town ownership of the Mulpus Brook, protection of the buffer area from logging and agriculture. I'm sure you can do anything with time, money, and permission. And so, you know, would it be possible to build a road down this 20-foot strip? You'd need permission, you know, you'd need time and you'd money, but it is wet. After you cross there, you go up over an esker. You know, there's a pretty sharp rise there. But thank you for allowing me to comment.
Thank you. Anyone else? Yes.
Dave Pastios, 56 Whiting Street. First of all, I'd like to ask if there's a quorum of the Conservation Commission here.
No.
There's not a quorum. Okay. I still question that last presentation as being appropriate without it being posted. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Can I make a public comment about a public comment?
Please.
Ken Jenna, 715 Page Street again. That was a great presentation, thank you. I just wanted to point out 2 things that weren't mentioned during the presentation. The Lunenburg Snow Riders is a great steward of the trail systems in town, and we deal with all kinds of challenging properties like this, and through cooperation with state grants, through our relationship with the Snowmobile Association of Massachusetts, we do get funding to build bridges that are in compliance with wetland crossing, and we have taken on projects like this plenty of times before. So if we did retain the ownership of the property, I have no doubt that we would be able to assist in establishing a trail head that would pass through there and provide adequate passage. The second thing I wanted to point out is we already have an existing easement right next to the easement that's proposed. The driveway that goes to Oliva's old property is already an easement. That is a foot traffic easement that allows access for neighbors onto that property as well. And that goes all the way to the town forest, and we have now connected the town forest again through the stewardship of the Lunenburg Snow Riders. The town forest is now connected to the Lane property with a sizable bridge that we installed. So for foot traffic, that easement already exists. We would be trading for an easement that is right next door to an easement we already have. And the conveyance doesn't include an ownership of the actual trail that you pointed out. That trail remains on the other people's property. It does not become Lunenburg property. So I just wanted to point that out in reference to the presentation that was made as public comment. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? Any public comment from the board?
Sure. Or maybe I'll just public comment as a citizen before we go to board comment. Our access is not in jeopardy. With a map, very carefully spent 2 hours out there today hiking the 20-foot path called the Harvey Lane that goes from Gilchrist to the Lane property, and step by step made sure we were on the path. And indeed, it was wet. We've had some torrential rains. I wore Hunter like muck boots, and my feet were dry the whole time, so nothing that some quality boots couldn't handle. I I think we're really out of line with this topic. I hope we don't go into executive session or deal with this topic any further tonight, because we're essentially, in my opinion, as a citizen, holding a public hearing without notifying the public that they could have participated. Especially think maybe people from Gilchrist or Valley View may have wanted to participate in this impromptu public hearing via public comment. The map that was part of this presentation was in my Google Doc, so that's weird. So there's like crossover here that's not in line with open government. And just sort of, I mean, the 20-foot path is very accessible, usable, but more importantly, like another member of the public pointed out, we've worked a lot of trails and you can overcome a wet area. This is a path that we own. And by keeping the path, we actually keep development lower along the Mulpus, 5 lots with the path, 7 lots without our path. Why municipal land would ever be sacrificed so that we can get an easement. There's so much here to talk about, but more importantly, my goal of becoming a selectman, in my opinion, as a citizen, was to make sure the public's always a part of everything we do. And tonight's a perfect example that we've invited and allowed something to happen here without letting everybody know we were doing it. And so I'm really opposed to everything that's just happened. And I don't think we should move forward on anything to do with this topic tonight until it's on an agenda in a way that I feel more comfortable as a citizen.
So that was a citizen public comment?
Yeah.
Okay. Is there any public comment from the board?
I have one public comment. Last week, we talked about the skate park, and I look forward to them coming with their maintenance requirements. I want to go on record that as long as those maintenance requirements are reasonable, I will be supporting it, even if it means the town will have to pay for some of those maintenance costs in the future. I think it's an important addition to our recreation part, and that we don't expect fundraising for every maintenance item to come forward.
Thank you. Anything else? Okay. I would entertain a motion under executive to enter into executive session under Mass General Law, Chapter 30, Section 21, Reason 6, to consider the purchase, exchange, lease, or value of real property if the chair declares that an open meeting may have a detrimental effect on the negotiating position of the public body. And that's to discuss 161 Gilchrist Street, Assessor Map, May 31, Parcel 10, and 171 Gilchrist Street, Assessor Map 31, Parcel 11, not to return to public session.
I would so move in light of town meeting vote to consider go into executive session as read by the chair.
Second.
Okay.
Any discussion?
Yes, one part of the discussion is going into executive session. This topic has been dealt with openly at conservation meetings, openly at ZBA, so I'm really strained to understand why we're going into executive session. And furthermore, in trying to understand it, I spoke to the Division of Open Government and had a conversation about why we're citing Purpose 6. And it's if you can prove that there's a detriment to the town. And in this situation, I think the town is losing something. We're losing something we own, and we're swapping it for more of an easement with a lot of gray area in there that I think needs to be discussed and talked about in public hearings. And their opinion on the circumstance is that it doesn't seem like there's anything that's detrimental to the town, and therefore it should reside in open session.
It is the chair's declaration that an open meeting may have a detrimental effect on our negotiating position.
In my discussions with the Division of Open Government, the detrimental effect is usually in a purchasing scenario, and we have to be able to prove what the effect is. So what is the detrimental effect of doing it in open meeting? We'd need to define, and I think we probably should.
The chair needs to declare it, and I have.
Can we have town council weigh in on what the Division of Open
I will
Government?
ask town council to weigh in.
Okay.
Is it appropriate for you to weigh in on that?
I'll weigh in briefly. So I found that, and I say this respectfully to all involved, I found that in consulting with the Division of Open Government, they can obviously only act upon the information that they're given. They are always hesitant to provide sort of off-the-cuff advice. They're always hesitant to provide anything in writing because they recognize that there are often two sides to every story. They recognize that they're not always given all the facts, they're not always given an opportunity, and rarely are they when you call them for on-the-spot advice, the opportunity to gather all the information they need, understand the background. So I say that because I've had frequent dealings with the division. Purpose 6, and the language of Purpose 6 is important. Purpose 6 is often used when real estate transactions are at issue, most often by a town's Board of Selectmen, because it's the Board of Selectmen that's the chief executive official of the community that has the authority to contract with respect to acquisitions or dispositions of real property. And it's in circumstances where the open meeting may have a detrimental effect. So, and it's a detrimental effect on the negotiating position of the town. So that's important. It's not necessarily that there's a detriment to the town. I would concur with what Selectman Adams said, that the suggestion here, at least what's being proposed, is that there's something to be gained by the town, possibly. And so there's no detriment to the town per se, but it's not a detriment to the town or the town's interest. It's a detriment to the negotiating position of the board. That's something that need not be quote unquote proven because of the word may. There's often no knowledge at this stage in the process whether there will be an impact on the negotiating position of the public body. So you might see a circumstance such as this and say to yourself, well, how can there be an impact? There is no consideration changing hands. If you look at the substance of the town meeting warrant article that was adopted, that was passed at town meeting, authorizing you to do what's been referred to as a land swap, you might say, well, what is there to negotiate? But I can foresee, without explicitly stating on the record, I can foresee circumstances where statements could be made, maybe unforeseen today, statements could be made in an executive session, which, if you choose not to go in executive session, would happen in open session, that could or may have a detrimental effect on the ability of the town to negotiate for that quote-unquote land swap. So in my estimation, based upon what I know here, based upon the authorization provided by town meeting, I think is within the chair's discretion to determine that there may be a detrimental impact on the negotiating position of the town. I can appreciate the counter argument, but I think that the support exists in these circumstances.
Thank you. And I just want to be clear that it is the negotiation and our negotiating position as a town that I want to ensure there's no detrimental effect to, not the actual transaction. All those in favor, please, aye. Mrs.
That's right, roll call.
Ms. Adams?
I'm going to go with a nay.
Mr. Eversole?
Aye.
Mr. McQuaid?
Aye.
And aye for myself. Thank you, everyone, and good night.